The universe has always feared Thanos for what he could do with power in his hands. They feared the Infinity Gauntlet, the armies he commanded, the worlds he crushed beneath his ambition. They feared the snap that erased half of all existence, and the cold logic that drove him to commit it. But what returns from the place beyond death is something the universe has never learned to fear, because it has never encountered anything like this before. When the final battle ended and Tony Stark's snap turned the Mad Titan to dust, everyone believed the story was over. The Avengers mourned their losses, rebuilt what they could, and moved forward with the weight of victory heavy on their shoulders. They told themselves that Thanos was gone, that the threat had been neutralized, that the universe could finally heal from the wounds he had inflicted. But cosmic energy does not simply disappear. It transforms, relocates, finds new vessels and new purposes. The snap did not destroy Thanos in the way everyone assumed. It displaced him, pushed him through the fabric of reality itself, until he fell into a place that exists beyond the reach of gods and the understanding of science. He fell into the void, and the void was waiting for something exactly like him. Time has no meaning in that place of absolute emptiness. There is no light to mark the passage of days, no sound to break the eternal stillness, no thought to provide comfort or torment. The void is not darkness in the way mortals understand darkness. It is absence made manifest, the space between existence, where forgotten things drift, without purpose or memory. Even the cosmic entities who shape galaxies whisper about the void with something resembling fear, because it represents the one thing they cannot control or comprehend. For Thanos, the experience was unlike anything his millennia of existence had prepared him for. He had conquered worlds, commanded armies, held the power of creation in his hand, but none of that mattered in the void. His strength meant nothing when there was nothing to strike. His intellect served no purpose when there were no problems to solve. His ambition withered in a place where achievement itself had no meaning. Day after day, year after year, century after century, the void stripped away everything that made Thanos who he was. His obsession with balance faded first, that driving purpose that had defined his entire existence simply dissolving into the emptiness around him. His love for death followed, that twisted devotion that had motivated his greatest atrocities becoming just another memory lost to the silence. His pride, his anger, his sense of self, all of it eroded like stone beneath an endless tide until nothing remained but a hollow vessel waiting to be filled with something new. The first sign that something had changed came not as an alarm or a warning, but as an absence that no one could quite identify. A small colony on the outer rim of known space simply stopped existing, not destroyed but removed from reality in a way that left no evidence it had ever been there at all. Ships that had been scheduled to visit the colony continued on their routes, their navigation systems showing empty space where a thriving settlement should have been. People who had family members on the colony found themselves unable to remember those family members' names, their faces, the sound of their voices. It was as if the universe itself had forgotten that those people ever existed, and that forgetting spread to everyone who had known them. The pattern repeated across dozens of worlds over the following months. A research station vanished, taking with it all records of the experiments conducted there and all memories of the scientists who had staffed it. A refugee fleet disappeared between star systems, and the survivors they had been fleeing to help could no longer remember what disaster had created refugees in the first place. Ancient libraries found their oldest texts transformed into blank pages, the knowledge they contained simply gone as if it had never been recorded. Investigators searching for answers found only more questions, their notes becoming illegible, their recordings filling with static, their memories growing hazier with each passing day. The Avengers began to notice the pattern when their own records started showing gaps they could not explain. Mission reports referenced team members whose names had been redacted by no human hand. Photographs showed empty spaces where someone should have been standing. Veterans of 100 battles found themselves unable to recall certain fights, certain victories, certain losses that they knew intellectually must have happened, but could no longer access emotionally. Something was wrong with reality itself. and that wrongness was spreading. Captain Marvel was the first to make direct contact with the source of the disturbance. Her cosmic senses had been tracking a strange gravitational signature for weeks, a ripple in space-time that moved with purpose through the void between stars. She followed it to a shattered moon orbiting a dead world, a place where nothing should have been living or moving or existing with intent. But something was there, standing motionless among the debris as if waiting for her arrival. The figure wore no armor, carried no weapons, displayed none of the theatrical menace that had characterized Thanos in his previous incarnations. He simply stood there, a shape that was familiar and alien at the same time, and Carol felt something she had never experienced in all her years of cosmic-level combat. She felt wrong, as if her own existence had become uncertain, as if the photons that composed her powers were forgetting how to behave. She attacked anyway, because that was what heroes did when faced with threats to the universe. She channeled everything she had into a single devastating strike, enough power to crack planets and ignite stars. And the energy simply vanished when it reached him. Not absorbed, not deflected, not countered with equal force. Just gone, as if it had never existed, as if the attack itself had been erased from the timeline the moment it was launched. The next thing Carol remembered was standing in Times Square with no memory of how she had returned to Earth, and a terrible certainty that the being she had confronted was no longer the Thanos anyone had known. He had become something else entirely, something that existed outside the rules that governed the rest of reality. Dr. Strange attempted to understand the threat through mystical means, employing techniques that had allowed him to perceive the true nature of cosmic entities and dimensional beings far beyond human comprehension. He cast a mind tether toward the presence that had been Thanos, a spell designed to read the deepest truths of any consciousness it touched. The connection lasted less than a second before Strange collapsed, blood streaming from his nose and eyes, his heart stopping for 6 terrible seconds before Wong managed to revive him. When the Sorcerer Supreme finally regained consciousness, he could barely form words to describe what he had experienced. There was no mind to read, no consciousness to understand, no soul to examine. There was only a vast and terrible emptiness wearing the shape of a being they had once known, a silence so profound that exposure to it had nearly erased Strange's own sense of self. He described it as looking into a mirror that reflected nothing, a void that existed not to destroy, but to forget and to make all things forget themselves. The other Avengers listened to his report with growing dread, recognizing that they faced something their combined experience had not prepared them to fight. Thor had battled cosmic threats his entire long life. Bruce Banner had faced his own inner demons and emerged stronger. Steve Rogers had led armies against impossible odds. But none of them had ever encountered an enemy that did not want to conquer or destroy, but simply to unmake the very concept of existence. The cosmic entities, who normally remained aloof from mortal affairs, took notice of the disturbance in ways that revealed the true scope of the threat. The living tribunal, arbiter of balance across all realities, convened a gathering of powers that had not assembled since the birth of the current universe. Eternity attended, the embodiment of all existence, alongside infinity and oblivion and the abstract forces that shaped the fundamental nature of reality. They observed the being that had once been Thanos and reached a conclusion that sent ripples of fear through every dimension. This was no longer a mortal threat to be contained or a cosmic imbalance to be corrected. This was something that had passed beyond their jurisdiction, a phenomenon that belonged to whatever came after existence itself ended. Their decision to take no action was not cowardice, but acknowledgement that intervention might accelerate the very outcome they wished to prevent. Adam Warlock, who had more experience with Thanos than perhaps any other being, sensed the change from across the galaxy and chose not to approach. He understood that the entity wearing his old enemy's form was no longer subject to the dynamics that had governed their previous conflicts. Silver Surfer discovered a dead world that had not been destroyed but simply forgotten by the universe, its history and people and meaning erased so completely that even the cosmic record showed only emptiness where a thriving civilization should have been documented. Ghost Rider attempted to judge the being, and found his power of penance meaningless against something that contained no guilt, no sin, no soul to burn. The spirit of vengeance screamed in agony at what he perceived, a reflection of nothingness, so complete that it threatened to erase his own identity just by existing. The transformation that had occurred within the void became clearer as the Avengers gathered intelligence and compared observations. The Thanos who had sought the Infinity Stones had been driven by conviction, however twisted that conviction might have been. He believed in his mission with religious fervor, saw himself as a necessary evil bringing balance to a universe that could not save itself. That sense of purpose had given him direction, motivation, a framework for understanding his own actions. But the void had stripped away that framework along with everything else, leaving behind a being that no longer believed in anything at all. The silence that had surrounded him for eons had become part of his nature, and now he sought to share that silence with all of existence, not out of malice or revenge or even the cold logic of his former self, but because silence was all he understood anymore. The whispers that psychics across the galaxy reported hearing in their dreams were not threats or warnings, but invitations. A single word repeated in every language across every frequency. Silence. The word carried with it a promise of peace, an end to struggle and suffering and the exhausting burden of existence. Some who heard it found themselves drawn to the idea, wondering if perhaps the universe had grown too loud, too chaotic, too full of noise that served no purpose. This was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the threat. It did not announce itself as evil or demand submission or offer terms of surrender. It simply suggested that maybe, after all these billions of years, everything had earned the right to rest. The Avengers refused to accept that suggestion, though they understood the appeal more than they wanted to admit. They had lost so much in their years of fighting to protect a universe that often seemed ungrateful for their sacrifices. They had buried friends and watched civilizations fall, and made impossible choices that haunted them in quiet moments. The promise of silence, of an end to responsibility and pain, and the endless cycle of threats that demanded their intervention, held a seductive quality that each of them recognized in their own hearts. But they had also experienced the alternative, the joy of connection, and the meaning found in struggle, and the profound satisfaction of standing between innocence and the forces that would destroy them. They chose to fight not because they believed they could win, but because the act of fighting itself was a statement of defiance against the erasure of meaning. Tony Stark had left behind fragments of his consciousness in AI systems throughout the Avengers infrastructure, and one of those fragments activated in response to the crisis. The holographic message that played for the assembled heroes showed a Tony Stark who had clearly been exhausted when he recorded it, a man who had glimpsed possibilities he hoped would never come to pass. His final gift was a suit of armor designed not to attack, but to remember, a technological anchor that could preserve identity and purpose even as reality itself forgot. Thor returned from his self-imposed exile, bearing a weapon forged from the hearts of dying stars, a hammer etched with runes that predated Asgard itself, and carried the power to break silence wherever it fell. Wanda Maximoff had seen visions of what was coming, fragmented and unclear, but pointing toward a resolution that none of them expected. The entity that had been Thanos moved toward Earth with a patient inevitability of entropy itself, leaving forgotten spaces in his wake where worlds and peoples and ideas simply ceased to have ever existed. The Avengers prepared their defense knowing that conventional tactics would prove meaningless against a threat that did not engage with reality on conventional terms. Steve Rogers understood that the battle they faced was not about physical victory, but about asserting the value of existence itself against a force that sought to render all existence meaningless. He gathered his team not with speeches about winning, but with quiet conversations about why they had chosen this life, why they had sacrificed so much, why they continued to stand when standing seemed futile. Each hero carried their own answer to those questions, their own reasons for refusing the peace that silence offered. Bruce Banner had learned to find purpose in the struggle between his human intellect and the Hulk's primal rage, a conflict that had defined him for so long that its absence would mean losing himself entirely. Thor had watched Asgard fall and risen from that loss stronger than before, understanding that meaning was not something granted by circumstance, but something created through choice. Wanda had lost everything that mattered to her and discovered that the capacity to love and grieve was itself a form of power that no cosmic force could simply erase. These were the weapons they would bring to the final confrontation. Not repulsor beams and magic hammers, but the accumulated weight of lives lived with intention. The beam that arrived on Earth bore Thanos' form, but none of his former presence. The Mad Titan had commanded attention through sheer force of personality, demanding that the universe acknowledge his power and his vision. This new entity simply existed, a patch of wrongness in the fabric of reality that made nearby objects seem less real by comparison. Heroes who approached found their memories growing uncertain, their sense of purpose fading, their very identities becoming questionable. The Avengers' countermeasures helped, the remembrance technology and the mystical anchors, and the sheer stubborn will of people who had chosen to matter. But even with those protections, confronting the silence directly was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. It slipped away no matter how tightly you gripped, and each moment of exposure cost something that could never be fully recovered. Yet they stood anyway, because standing was what they had always done and what they would continue to do until they could no longer remember why it mattered. Thor struck with his new hammer, and the silence cracked, just for an instant, just enough to reveal something underneath the emptiness. The being that had been Thanos was not empty by nature, but by choice, a decision made in the endless void when all other options had been stripped away. Somewhere within that vast silence, buried beneath eons of forgetting, there remained a fragment of the entity that had once believed in something strongly enough to reshape the universe in pursuit of it. The resolution came not through violence, but through connection, as Wanda's vision had suggested it might. A presence emerged from the void that surrounded Thanos, something born from the same emptiness that had transformed him, but carrying a different purpose. This child of the silence had no name, no history, no existence prior to the moment when Thanos first entered the void and left behind traces of what he had been. She was a reflection of everything he had forgotten, a repository for the meaning he had discarded, and she approached him not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The Avengers watched as she spoke words that no one else could hear, as something passed between two beings that existed outside the normal parameters of reality. Whatever she said, whatever truth she carried, it reached the fragment of Thanos that remained buried beneath the silence. For one eternal moment, the being that had sought to erase all meaning confronted the meaning it had lost, and the universe held its breath. The silence did not end. The threat was not defeated in any conventional sense, but it paused, reconsidered, and turned away from Earth toward destinations unknown. The Avengers had not won a victory they could celebrate. They had simply reminded the universe, and perhaps themselves, that existence carried value even when that value could not be measured or proven. The cities that had been forgotten remained forgotten. The people who had been erased did not return. But the erasure stopped, at least for now, and that was enough to call it survival, if not success. The aftermath left more questions than answers, as the greatest crises always do. The child of the void departed with the being that had been Thanos. Two impossible entities moving through spaces that mortal minds could not map toward purposes that mortal minds could not guess. The Avengers returned to their lives knowing that the threat had not been eliminated, only postponed, and that the price of their survival had been paid by countless beings who would never be remembered. They carried that weight because carrying weight was what they had always done, and because someone had to remember the forgotten even if the details had been lost forever. Steve Rogers spoke to his team about what they had learned, not about tactics or strategies, but about the fundamental question that the confrontation had forced them to face. Why does existence matter? Why do we fight to preserve something so fragile, so temporary, so easily erased? The answers varied from hero to hero, shaped by their individual experiences and losses and hopes. But beneath the variations ran a common thread, a shared conviction that meaning was not something found, but something made. The universe did not owe them purpose. purpose was something they created through their choices, their sacrifices, their refusal to surrender to the silence that waited at the end of all things. This was the legacy they would carry forward, the lesson they had learned from an enemy who had forgotten everything except the desire to forget. As long as someone remembered why existence mattered, the silence could not win completely. As long as someone chose to stand against the darkness could not claim final victory. The story continued because stories were how meaning survived, passed from one generation to the next, preserved against the entropy that sought to reduce all things to forgotten dust. The Avengers had not saved the universe in any permanent sense. They had simply bought it more time to create more meaning, to tell more stories, to matter in ways that the silence could never fully erase. And for now, in this moment, that was enough.